About 10 years ago, I was waking up in a small motel in the Poconos. I was walking back and forth from the bathroom to the television, catching the local news along the way, waiting on the weather, and eager to check out and walk next door to the diner. The diner had baklava, and the sandwich the night before was pretty good, and I was eager to explore their breakfast offerings prior to spending the better part of a workday driving west, back toward Butler County, preferably with a stop in Evansburg. As I'm throwing yesterday's clothes into my small tweed suitcase, I begin to hear an arson story. A guy had set a local restaurant on fire. According to the suspect, he was asked by the restaurant's owner to set the fire. And none of that was especially interesting to me, but what did catch my ear and then my eye was that the news anchor spoke about how this guy was known about the Stroudsburg area as he'd been involved with the Stroudsburg police in a strange situation. The man, it was said, could make it rain. His story was even featured on Unsolved Mysteries, a show I watched regularly as a kid, and his story had been corroborated by police officers. This is the strange tale of Don Decker, Rain Man. Don Decker's rain story begins early in 1983 when at the age of 20 or 21 his grandfather died. Don was 20 or 21, not his grandfather. I realize that's kind of an ambiguous sentence. Don's grandfather was 63 when he died in the Stroudsburg area, but I've seen Don's age being reported as both 20 and 21. This is an awesome start. Anyhow. According to the Unsolved Mysteries episode, Don had been furloughed from the county jail where he was serving a brief sentence for having received stolen property. The county in question was the Monroe County, and the county jail in question was the Monroe County Correctional Facility, none of this being identified on the Unsolved Mysteries segment. Following his grandfather's funeral, Don stayed with some friends in their rented home on Ann Street in Stroudsburg, which is right downtown between McMichael Creek and Main Street thereabouts. The residence, though, has since been demolished. All right, so there are a couple different versions of the story. One, the one documented in the 1993 episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and from what I gather, a slightly different version which was chronicled on a 2011 episode of Paranormal Witness. It is my assumption that the discrepancies in each story come down to two main factors. One, the story had changed over the course of 30 years. And number two, and this is likely a smaller factor, the stories were edited for television time constraints. I'm going to try to tell the most complete story, but each incarnation of the story finds Don stating that his recently deceased grandfather had been physically abusive to him since he had been a young child. The subsequent funeral and adoration upon the recently deceased was what prompted Don to stay with his friends, and it would be at their Ann Street residence that the rain would begin. Later on, in 2011, it was stated that Don's mother would not allow him to stay at her home, so he went to stay with his friends, the Kiefers. Earlier stories state that the rain began after dinner at the Kiefers. The rain began in the living room, having been preceded by a cold vibration which Don felt through his body. He then fell into a stupor, a trance-like state, as the rain began running down the walls, isolated, it seems, to the living room. In later tellings, though, it is said that Don fell on the bathroom floor and had a vision of an old man wearing a crown staring at him. I've also read that he saw the vision of the old man through the window of the upstairs bathroom and then fell. He got up to find scratches upon his wrists, and then he went downstairs to supper when the rain would start, being immediately preceded by a loud noise. A quick aside, I definitely think this was added to the story later, this whole bit about the old man and the crown, Because why would Unsolved Mysteries not have run with a ghostly bathroom visitor? I just can't imagine such a program passing that up for a boring old run of the mill cold chill in the living room. And plus, could you imagine the reenactment? Moving on. The Kiefers telephoned their landlord right away. There's some plumbing emergency, clearly. There's water just everywhere. And that assumption was completely reasonable that there was a plumbing issue. Upon arrival, the landlord assured everyone that there was no plumbing behind the walls in the living room. All the plumbing was in the back of the house where the kitchen and above it bathroom were. The landlord himself said as much for the Unsolved Mysteries crew. Going further is to state that the water was coming not just from the ceiling down, but also the floor up, even horizontally, a claim that was further corroborated by a couple of Stroudsburg police officers. The Kiefers and their landlord noticed that Decker was in a trance-like state and decided to call the police. Two officers, Don Bujan, and I hope I'm saying that right, and Richard Wolbert responded to the call, with Bujan stating in multiple interviews that the rain was localized to the living room and droplets could be seen flying horizontally. They contacted the chief of police, a man named Roberts, who did not feel that the situation was an appropriate police matter and requested them to leave. A lot of folks really drive home that Chief Roberts told the responding officers not to file a report. The officers came back the next day, though, against orders of the chief, and this time they were accompanied by a third cop, an Officer Davies. They tried some experiments, which Unsolved Mysteries reenacted by showing the police officers placing a large brown paper bag over Don's head. Then, with the paper bag on his head, again for science, the police watched as Don was thrown as if by some invisible force across the room. Police noted that the rain in the house would stop when Don would step outside. Officer Bujan stated that Don was burned by a gold cross. This would become thematic, and the Unsolved Mysteries episode would conclude with visiting a pizzeria where shortly after Don's entrance it would begin raining, and there was a burning hot crucifix there as well. Now again, here's where the 1993 and the 2011 versions of the story again differ. After 3 days being turned down for multiple denominations, an evangelical reverend performed an exorcism and all would be well again. The landlord stated in interviews that he was there for the exorcism and watched Don Decker convulse and curl into a ball. The Unsolved Mysteries story may be abbreviated, but again, because of how spectacular it claims, I have doubts, because Don did return to the correctional facility shortly after his wet and wild weekend with the Kiefers, but not before additional claims such as being levitated and thrown about the house. The rain would not stop when he was back in his cell. This is according to the Paranormal Witness episode that states further he had control of the rain and utilized it to secure a private cell, among other things. This would all end when the warden, and here I'm quoting Sci-Fi Channel's website, immediately called in the prison chaplain for an exorcism. The more the priest spoke, the more Don smelled rotting flesh. The room filled with rain, but it never hit the Bible in the chaplain's hands. The odor became more intense. Don knew he smelled death. Don screamed in agony, and the rain stopped. The chaplain called out to escape the room. Don opened his eyes, hoping it was all over. So, again, here's the difference. Unsolved Mystery said there was an exorcism in the Kiefers' home, and then all was resolved after that, all in the span of 3 or 4 days. The Paranormal Witness show states that Don had not only continued to make it rain when he was back in the correctional facility, but also now had some control over it. So was the Kiefers' landlord present at the jail exorcism? I have a hard time believing that for a few reasons, but namely the urgency with which the latter exorcism supposedly occurred. Why would they invite him? Also, each telling suggests that Don was possessed by the spirit of his abusive grandfather, or at least the evil which made his grandfather abusive. And the landlord's wife claims that the longer the evangelical reverend prayed, the more she could feel a change in the house and not a change in the Monroe County Correctional Facility. It isn't possible for both these stories to be true, but it is possible for both of them to be false. Further, the paranormal witness episode claims that on a dare from guards, Don was able to make a raindrop move through several locked doors, presumably through a keyhole, and hit the warden square in the chest. For the sake of argument, I'm going to say the guy is possessed by the spirit of his abusive grandfather who, for some unknown reason, gives Don the power to make it rain, maybe as some sort of weird trade-off for being able to make him levitate and to scratch him. I don't know. Who knows how these things work? But let's say I give you all of that. Am I supposed to believe that Don can also see through doors and walls, not just hit a corrections officer, but also do so directly in the chest? I know I'm coming at this a little harder from the skeptical angle than I normally do. Not that I'm not typically skeptical of such things, but I feel like I've been especially hard on this one, as I am, say, the supposed lost gold of central Pennsylvania, but for much the same reasons. There are two very similar stories which appear to originate from the same person. But that said, there are multiple people, including landlords and police officers, who continue to this day to claim that what they experienced was real. Who am I to doubt what they experienced? This was going on for, at a minimum, a weekend, and if the 2011 version of the story is true, longer. So why are there no pictures or film? I've seen other people bring this up only to be told that camcorders and other such devices were not so easily obtainable in 1983, and I agree, but that doesn't mean that they weren't available, or at least a camera, especially with police involved. And if they were experimenting, how were they supposed to be documenting any of this? Could they have not contacted the local news? Sure, not everyone would, but a number of the involved parties have been filmed on television about the event, so it's not like they're camera shy. Maybe they just didn't think of it. Or maybe they did experience water problems in the house. There is the possibility of a leaky roof, especially in winter, which is when the events took place. Water is the bane of property ownership, and roofs and flashing and all that. Too often, by the time you realize there's a problem, it's been going on for a while, and the damage you see is just the tip of the iceberg. It's one of the reasons I won't have a skylight. Also, it's possible that the landlord didn't know about plumbing that was in the house on the other side. Maybe he had bought the house and plumbing had been moved around. It's certainly possible. And again, with it being in winter, it's possible that the pipes in that wall froze and water under pressure will fly sideways. It just doesn't sound that unreasonable. I was scouring my newspaper archive resources, access, the same ones that we use when we record our past periodical episodes, and I cannot find anything on Decker until the arson. That doesn't mean there weren't news articles, local news articles about the original 1983 incidents. My resources are not complete, and I may have just not caught it, but it doesn't give me any further reason to believe it could be true. As it happens, if you come across an article from that time about this whole episode, please let us know about it. As it was, the only news I can find on Decker would be a YouTube clip of the same arson story I saw in a hotel room on WNEP out of Scranton. That occurred back in October of 2011. And he had set fire to the restaurant, as I said earlier, Dana's in Toby Hanna, Monroe County. The report states that he had been hired by the owners to do so and that he had voluntarily turned himself in. WNEP recapped Decker's appearance on the Unsolved Mysteries episode and even interviewed now Detective Wolbert, who continues to assert that he had responded to what was initially a plumbing problem that entered a realm which he could not explain. He reiterated that he witnessed water traveling horizontally through the house. Detective Wolbert, though, in the WNEP interview further stated that it was strange, definitely a plumbing issue, but that he couldn't explain it. He went on to say that Decker's explanation was that his deceased relative had something to do with it, but that the explanation came only from Decker. The television news also ran the headline Fire and Rain because that low-hanging fruit was just too irresistible. Aside from Detective Wolbert, who appeared on camera, nobody else involved in the 1983 incidents were interviewed. According to reporter Reagan Medji, again, I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. According to her, though, they had reached out to more witnesses, but none would come forward, with at least one of them saying what they had seen was just too upsetting and too creepy to talk about. And again, maybe it was. Maybe this is all true. But the detective's statements in 2011 seem much more reasonable to how they were presented during the Unsolved Mysteries episode. It's not hard to think that a police officer might not be able to diagnose a plumbing problem. And maybe it was especially weird. Maybe it was the convergence of several bad things happening at once that led to all this water in the living room. And maybe the people involved were scared, especially with Don telling the story about his abusive grandfather possessing him. Maybe they were. And maybe later it came out that it was a issue of some sort completely within the realm of reality, and that maybe they continue to stick to the story because the story has just grown too big. And maybe, too, they don't want the truth to come out that it was a simple thing and that they had overreacted. That seems completely plausible as well. I know there's a lot of people that really defend this story is true, but honest to goodness, they're both compelling stories, but they cannot both be true because it's clearly stated in 1993 that there was an exorcism in the house, which the landlord and the landlord's wife attest to. They said they were in the house, the exorcism occurred, everything was done at the end of a weekend. But in 2011, there's all this claptrap about him controlling rain inside a prison cell, and then the county correctional facility bringing in an exorcism. That doesn't jive with me. Why would they think to invite the landlord? Not even Decker had any sort of relationship with the landlord. Either way, this is the story of Don Decker, Rainman, and now arsonist. It's an interesting story, but I think it's well past time to put the paranormal claims of this one to bed.